the last issue I mentioned in the last video was a question about whether our bias toward the future is a good or bad thing for us. And let's put that in terms of happiness. That is, what I think what Parfit is asking is, would we be happier if we were like timeless? That is, would we be happier if we had a temporally neutral attitude towards our experiences? Well, let's look at it this way. What is bad about death? What is bad about aging? What is, if we consider aging simply as getting closer to death? Maybe that's what the whole class is about. But one way of accounting for that is this: that each person's life contains a finite amount of goods, good things, good experiences, things that we value. As we move through time, from birth to death, the total number of those goods gradually become more in the past than in the future. That is, the closer we get to death, that is, the more we age, the more of our goods, the good things in our lives, are in the past rather than in the future, and that progressively, things progressively get more lopsided. And you know, that's too bad for beings like us, because beings like us are biased towards the future. We care more about future goods and future sufferings too than we do about past goods and past sufferings. So our goods, the total amount of goods in our lives on this attitude sort of slip away gradually. I mean, that is that they mean less and less to us because more and more of them are in the past rather than in the future. So this is why I think Parfit takes the attitude that he does in this section on page 205 in the beginning of this section, which is entitled "Why We Should Not Be Biased Towards the Future." He says our bias towards the future is bad for us. It would be better for us if we were like timeless. We would lose in certain ways. Thus, we should not be relieved when bad things were in the past, but we should also gain. We should not be sad when good things were in the past. That is, if it were the case that good things in the past meant just as much to us and we derived just as much satisfaction or happiness from them being in the past as them knowing that they're in the future, we would be happier, would we not? Especially as we got towards closer to the end of our lives. He puts it pretty well on page 206. He says, "Let us now suppose that we lack the bias toward the future." And he's established in the previous section, or he's argued in the previous section, that that's conceivable. That is, that our bias towards the future is not inevitable, that we can conceive of a being like ourselves, but who does not have that bias. So suppose now that we lack the bias towards the future, we are like timeless. We should then greatly gain in our attitude to aging and to death. As our life passes, we should have less and less to look forward to, but more and more to look backward to. That is, if we could imagine, because we can imagine, a being who derived as much satisfaction from the past goods in their lives as they do from the anticipation of future goods in their lives. Imagine a person who, if given a choice of on the one hand, having had an ice cream cone yesterday or getting an ice cream cone tomorrow, is indifferent to that because they derive as much satisfaction of having their goods in the past as anticipating having them in the future. Imagine that we were like that we would on the whole be happier, because the closer we got to death, which meant the fewer goods we had left to experience, and the more goods we had in the past that we had experienced, we would on the whole be happier because we would derive more satisfaction from the goods in our lives, because the fact that they were in the past rather than the future would be a matter of indifference to us. says, for instance, on page 207, now suppose that our lives have nearly passed. We shall die tomorrow. If we were not biased towards the future, our reaction should mirror the one I have just described. We should not be greatly troubled by the thought that we shall soon cease to exist, for though we now have nothing to look forward to, we have our whole lives to look backward to. Now, there are some problems with that. I mean, problems with that he tries to deal with, but generally, he believes that we could be such beings. There's no conceptual, logical barrier preventing us from being such beings. And on the whole, we would be better off, in the sense we'd be happier if we were such beings, which we're not, of course, because we do have a temporal bias built in. He says on the top of page 208, if we were like timeless, being at the end of our lives would be more like being at the beginning. That is, if you're at the beginning of your life, we have that expression, you have your whole life to look forward to, how fortunate you are. But if we were like timeless, if we were at the end of our lives, we could say you have your whole life to look backward at how fortunate you are. Now, there's some difficulties there about past suffering, too, because we would not be the kind of creatures who would be relieved to know that our sufferings were in the past rather than the future. But he believes that we could selectively review our memories to give us overall a greater amount of satisfaction by concentrating and rehearsing in our minds the good experiences of our past rather than the bad experiences of our time. But of course, we're not like that. I mean, sorry. We aren't timeless. We're temporal beings, and we have, more importantly, we have temporal biases. We have temporal preferences. Why exactly we do, maybe it's kind of a mystery. But he suggests something of that at the end of this section. He says, since I believe that this attitude is bad for us, this preference for the future, I believe that we ought not to be biased towards the future. This belief does not beg the question about the rationality of this basis. On any plausible moral view, it would be better if we were all happier. This is the sense in which, if we could, we ought not to be biased towards the future. In giving us this bias, evolution denies us the best attitude to death. That's pretty interesting. And, this is not a very dramatic book. I mean, this is a book of very, very meticulously argued points about rationality, morality, ethics, being a person. But there's something quite dramatic about that, quite tragic about that, isn't it? I mean, that is, we are, for no fundamentally good reason, biased towards the future, and that means that perhaps it's rational for us to value certain experiences over others, and that's just the way we are. But it could be different, and in the ways that it could be different, Parfit is saying our lives would, on the whole, be happier, because we wouldn't have the regrets that we do, seemingly, about death. I mean, we would, knowing that we were going to die tomorrow, and that we would have no future goods after tomorrow, would perhaps not bother us so much, because we had so many goods in the past, and they mean just as much to us as any goods in the future. We're not those type of beings, but what Parfit is saying, and I don't know if this is true, but it's certainly something to think about, we would be a heck of a lot happier if we were.